So as I mentioned today, we're going to just have more of a general conversation about mental health. We we've discussed, how we define abnormality and abnormal behavior, and how those can be related to the diagnosis of different psychological disorders. But what we want to look at today is just like with physical disorders, we recommend, exercise, diet, all of those types of things. There's also recommendations for our mental health as much as there is our physical health. And again, you'll see that these are very much related as we go through this conversation, as we've discussed in previous conversations, that really when we look at our mental life, it's not much different than our physical life, and we need to pay attention to both of them equally and in the same group. So the where I want to start is talking about what is mental health, because it is kind of a taboo term, because no one likes to think that they can have something mentally wrong with them, or that we're not performing to our best. And as we mentioned in the beginning of the class, one of the approaches to abnormal, our understanding of abnormal behaviors is the egocentric perspective, where I'm not abnormal, but everyone else who doesn't behave like me is abnormal. And so we have some protective devices to kind of say, yeah, I'm mentally healthy. I handle my stuff. And again, when we look at the moral corruption theory and the centuries of seeing someone who is not mentally tough as weak and vulnerable and susceptible to things like being possessed by demons or the like, or being persuaded by the devil, as an example, we can see why people um, um, don't always focus very much on what is mental health. Um, but I just kind of want to start with some statistics about the numbers and whatnot to mental health. Uh, I'm hoping to update these soon, but they're always about 2-3 years in lag. So the best numbers we have come from 2020, which, as you may remember, we were in kind of the thick of the COVID-19 pandemic. So these numbers um, um, reflect that as well. But I should state that the trends that we see are not much different than when we were in the thralls of the pandemic. So these numbers have kind of held true. We're just waiting for the official numbers to come out from the National Association for Mental um, Illness. So yeah, I think that's what it stands for. Anyways, so what we have is, on the left panel, we have mental health numbers for adults. And on the right panel, we have mental health numbers for adolescents. Now, you may be asking, well, what about children? Children numbers are a little bit harder to ascertain, because it's in most states it's not till adolescence, where the adolescent has control over their mental health, their privacy with their doctor, those types of things. When we get into childhood, their data is much more protected, and so a lot of our mental health data really depends upon what we see in adolescence. So just as a note. But starting with adults, we can see that 1 in 5 adults experience a mental illness. And of that 1 in 5, 1 in 20 experience a serious mental illness. Now, what's the difference between a serious mental illness and experiencing mental illness? Well, it's kind of the same as if we it's kind of the same as breaking your leg versus spraining your leg, if you want to put it in that context. Breaking the leg requires more serious intervention, while a sprain or an overextension, it hurts, and it feels almost like a broken leg, but it doesn't require an extensive intervention to help it heal. Okay. 1 in 15 uh, adults experiencing a substance use disorder and mental illness at the same time. And in most of these cases, it's using the substance in order to mask the symptoms of the mental illness. During the pandemic, we saw a large increase in alcohol consumption, and the data that we have so far is that increase in consumption has to do with a masking of something, a mental illness or something going on inside the person or the person's relationships. We should note that 12 plus million individuals had serious thoughts of suicide. And suicide is one of those things that we will be talking about in depth in the class, because it has been on the increase over the last couple of decades. And it's an interesting trend because what we usually see with suicide versus homicide, suicide being a uh, self-killing, homicide being killing someone else, is usually when we see suicide rates go up, we see homicide rates go down. But what has been interesting over about the last 13, 14 years is both of them have been trending upward. And so it's an it's a sad, but it's an interesting thing that we're seeing in our modern time that just really hasn't been prevalent in past research in past decades. Okay. Um, 1 in 5 during the pandemic state that they had a serious impact on their mental health due to the pandemic. So that plays into these numbers as we'll see. And then I'm going to jump over here to adolescents and young adults. So with our adolescents, we're seeing that 1 in 6 experience a major depressive episode. Okay, and think about that, major depressive episode. And even a little bit more scary is when we look at our young adults between 18 to 25, we look at adults and 1 in 5 experience a mental illness, but 1 in 3 young adults experience a mental illness. And just in comparison, 1 in 10 versus 1 in 20 experienced a serious mental illness. So it's a kind of a nerve-wracking perspective when we look at this age group. And as we go through the course, we'll look at different age groups and how they've responded to mental health. Some have argued, some researchers have argued that the numbers between young adults and adults are a reflection of individuals in younger age groups' willingness to seek out help when they have a mental illness. So on one side, it that we have a group with significant mental health issues, or is it that we have a older group who still have that mindset that it's not, you know, you shouldn't seek treatment for mental health? So that's one of the kind of arguments that's going on right now is does it deal with more with attitude, or is there a something serious going on with this age group? And we'll explore it as we go through different disorders, especially when we get to depression and anxiety, and we'll look at, you know, are there different pressures that and environmental triggers that maybe 18 to 25 are going through versus older groups. So, but I just wanted to give kind of that summary of different um, difference in mental health as of 2020. And as I said, we're seeing trends similar to this continuing on, even after COVID restrictions were lifted. You would think that some of these issues would abate themselves, and we see the, you know, even with our strengthening of the economy, job numbers going down, these numbers are still kind of holding, but we'll need to wait for the official numbers to come out. So now let's explore, now that we have kind of an idea population wise, what's going on with mental health. Let's move to, I just want to bring up some things that we learned during the pandemic. Okay. Um, and first of all, I want to explain this graph. Um, this graph represents, if we look to about right here, represents about the first 6 months of the pandemic. Okay. This after represents following months and continuing trends. Okay. But I'll discuss kind of what happened right here in a minute. But when we look at these trend lines, a way to read these is this is mental and emotional health. Both lines kind of can represent that. One represents loneliness, sadness. The other one represents different other symptomologies of things like depression and anxiety. The shaded area, these shaded areas, so for example, I'll use this over here from here to here, represents what we call the spread, meaning that the line represents more of the average, but we see people scoring this high and we see people scoring this low. Okay. And the interesting thing, and just everybody knows where this data comes from, when the pandemic began, different site national associations for psychology came out, and and they got together and said, you know what, we need to measure what's going on psychologically with people during the pandemic. And so they opened up this sourcing, and this represents a sample size of over 500,000 people across the globe that took a continued mental health survey throughout the pandemic. Okay. And so it's representative, and it includes pretty much every ethnic group that we're aware of that have access to computers and online. So because this was an online type thing, there were no phones. So it's very representative of kind of people living in the modern time, but also representing a wide spread of ethnic groups. Okay. So, but what did we find? The interesting thing is, in the first 6 months of the pandemic, we saw individuals doing really well, actually. We There wasn't much deviation um, between individuals, meaning that everyone was having the same response and response rates. And we actually saw better mental health. We actually, when we look at this from a loneliness perspective, which is one of my areas of studies, in that first 6 months of the pandemic, people were less lonely than the trending average. So, but then something around the 6 month mark created a change. It created a change in where some people continued to be successful. You can see this by the lower shaded areas, okay? Continued to be okay. But then a spread occurred where then there were parts of our population that were doing much worse, that were experiencing, in this case, a lot more loneliness, a lot more mental health issues. And so we what we wanted to do is examine one, how did we all start off okay, but then why all of a sudden did we have this huge spread between those who were doing worse off and those who were staying pretty stabilized? And then there was a whole population in between those two. And so when we look at this, the thing that I want us to keep in mind here um, is that it very much had to do with how socially connected we were able to keep during the pandemic. Social connection meaning in two domains: one, emotionally, someone we can emotionally connect with, and two, socially connecting and keeping with peers and family members, keeping those people in our life. Okay. And what we found in this trend, okay, is, remember this first 6 months we were locked up, right? but we were with family. We were still connecting. And so we didn't see much deviation from each other. And what we saw is that the people who started to decompensate by these higher numbers were individuals who, one, were isolated, two, stopped communicating, and three, when we go into, for example, their homes, they don't have any reminders of their loved ones, such as pictures of siblings or pictures of kids, or and what we found with the people who were successfully isolating and getting through the pandemic is that they had in their home continued reminders of family, of friends, of loved ones. And so that ability to stay connected was important following that first 6 months of trending. Okay. And so we know that there is something to be said about social connection and maintaining positive mental health. Okay. And so what I want to get into, based on some of the things that we found and other research that we've done on this, is the factors that positively and negatively influence mental health. Okay. And I do want to provide a definition of mental health. I just realized I didn't do this in the beginning. The definition that we're working for mental health is not the lack of a mental illness. Okay. It's not a lack of a disorder of some type. When we're talking about mental health, we're talking about a person is thriving in life. They are engaged in life. They're able to get up and go to their job and be active in their job and active in their family life, but also maintain good rest and good um, um, mindset about the world. That's how we're defining mental health. Um, and so, with that definition, these are some different factors that we know either can positively or negatively influence a person's mental health. Okay. And the first one we're going to talk about is identity and culture versus lack of identity and culture. Okay. And what I mean, what is meant by this is we have things called social identities. Social identities include our identity, for example, of being a student, um, um, of being a parent, of being an employee of some type. It is being a brother, sister. It's being a grandparent if you're near my age group and have kids. It's for me, it's being a psychologist and a professor. And so it's all of those things that are provided to us by our social world and have been defined socially that we integrate into who we are as an individual. Part of social identity is our cultural identity. Cultural identity being, do we feel connection with the people we feel we belong to? And do we have a healthy connection with that historical past of your given people, of the people you identify with the most? Okay. And what we have found is that people who have a healthy social identity and cultural identity fare out mentally more mental health, more mental healthily. I don't know if that's a word or not. Than people who lack a sense of identity and purpose and lack a sense of some type of connection with who they are and the people in their past. Um, and I can give an example of this because I've struggled with this issue too. Is I was raised to believe that my past was the American past, that my past goes to the George Washingtons and the Ben Franklins and all those people, the founders of America, and that history, Civil War, all that kind of stuff is part of my past. But the truth of the matter is it's really not, because my grandmother immigrated here in the 1930s. And so my true past, my history really has nothing to do with the formation of the United States until after the 1930s, and it took a little bit of time for Grandma to, find someone and make a family. And so my past is an immigrant past, and my roots go back to Prussia and those places. That's my past, and and just to say that's been one of my struggles in my mental health journey, is having that lack of understanding of where I actually come from. It has been a struggle, and so it's contributed to some of my mental health issues. So I just want to bring that up as an example of what happens when we lose our identity and we lose our culture, and it's important to keep those things. Okay, so that's identity. And the other thing we'll get to when we get to different treatments of different mental disorders is we're finding that when a therapist implements understanding of identity and understanding of culture into the therapeutic process, it increases the success of that therapeutic modality. So we'll get to that too when we're talking about recovering or treatment of some different mental disorders. The other thing we find is situational happiness versus continuous happiness. Just to give a quick definition of these two, situational happiness is happiness when you're at the birthday party, a graduation, anniversary, if you a holiday, your favorite holiday, and it's that happiness you experience in that moment versus continuous happiness. And I want to be clear, I don't think there's a single human being that is always of joy, like you are at a party or at a birthday party or something like that. And they're always happy and da 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 da. We'd be hard pressed to find individuals like that. But what continuous happiness is, it's a person who understands, who has a different mindset when they're going through troubled times. Okay, someone who has continuous happiness can be experiencing something like, let's say, a divorce or a death of a parent, but they have a different mindset in that they know that this is just a moment of struggle, and as long as they keep moving forward, everything will be okay eventually. Okay, and to think about that in a different setting, in that um, uh, versus someone who's not continuous happiness, and they get into a traumatic situation or trauma or a normal life troubles, and they start to think, oh my gosh, this is who I am now. I'm never going to get over this. I'm never going to, this is horrible. This is horrible happening to me. And if you hear the difference between those two types of individuals, we find that the person in the continuous happiness category tends to be um, the one who tends to have better mental health. Going back to the situational happiness component too, is that when we spend our life only looking forward to that next happy moment, okay, I can think about this as people who they get to their Monday and the only thing they look forward to is Friday, because Friday is the end of the week. It's time to have fun, those kinds of things. That's a form of situational happiness. And we find that individuals who are always trying to look over that next horizon for that next happy moment tend to have poor mental health. They have poor quality of life, is the term that we would use in this situation. Okay.
Mm.
All right. And then the third one is social connection versus loneliness, which we'll get into more here in just a minute. And I've already mentioned it when I gave the pandemic example. But people who tend to stay socially connected, right down to even emailing someone in their email list once a week and just saying, hey, I'm thinking of you. maintaining that kind of social connection boosts mental health processes. In fact, in a lot of research about doing random emails each week or just calling someone and saying hi, I'm thinking about you, we have actually found in neurological research that it opens up the dopamine areas of the brain. And when those areas of the brain are open, we're more open to experiences. We have clear thought processes. We tend to focus on what needs to get done, and those types of things. So versus loneliness, which again we're going to get in more depth here in just a few minutes. I'll just give a preview of what we'll talk about when we talk about loneliness. Is that we have found in continued research on the issue of loneliness, which we'll define again here in a few minutes, that loneliness is just as good predictor of mortality and morbidity. Mortality being when we'll pass away, the probability of when we'll pass away at what age. Morbidity is the probability of getting some type of physical or psychological disorder. Okay. We have found that loneliness is just a good predictor of those two things as smoking behavior, uh, eating behavior, and exercise behaviors. Just as good, if not better. In fact, loneliness actually predicts those things better than your eating habits do. So we'll discuss this component in a little bit more detail as we move forward. We can look at these two categories um, in congruence with each other because they both have a similar influence, and that's friendships versus toxic friends, intimate relationships versus toxic relationships. And the first thing that I want to do in this conversation is define what we mean by toxic. We use the word toxic because we like to use the analogy of an acid, which is a toxic element, right? And when you put acid on a metal that it's going to eat through, it doesn't immediately just go right through the metal. What it does is it sits there and dissolves the metal slowly until eventually there's a big hole in that metal. Okay. And so that's what we're meaning by toxic friendships and toxic intimate relationships, is these are relationships that immediately we think, wow, this is great, this is wonderful, everything's going good. And then over time, that person either comes to be completely controlling over the individual, or that person completely is ruining the other person's life. I have a good friend recently who started a job at a place, and this is a co-worker example. And in the beginning, everything was good, everything was going well. But over time, those co-workers started to be very negative. They started to be very aggressive. And it got to the point that my good friend wasn't able to sleep at night. Um, uh, the person was having difficulties in her relationships outside of work. And it resulted in her resigning from that situation in order to bring back bring back her mental health, bring back the ability to sleep at night and those types of things. And I use this example, it's a recent one that a good friend of mine has gone through, but it's an example of what happens when you maintain that toxicity. It starts to affect your sleep, it starts to affect your relationships with those you have healthy relationships with, and it really influences your life. Okay. When we look at the intimate relationship part, we can talk about things like domestic violence, which includes physical, emotion, psychological violence. But we can also look at it from this toxic friend perspective, someone who is just constantly feeding off of you and being a leech, or is narcissistic, and it continually ruins and breaks you down over time. Okay. And we find, as my example suggests, has huge influences on one's mental health and ability to function in life. Okay. Um, the sixth one, this one is closely related to our example of happiness. But it's living an engaged and an authentic life, which we use the term thriving versus surviving. Surviving is when we're getting up every day and just dredging through the day, just trying to get through it, trying to get from waking up and getting out of bed to being able to go home and get back into bed and go to sleep. That is surviving life. Engaging an authentic life, engaging in that we seek out experiences in life. Authentic life is that we live life to, how do I say, to who we are. And probably the best example is people who are really happy at work and really happy with who they are as a professional and in their life. And if you talk to a lot of these individuals, they will say that work is a part of who they are, and they don't see a difference between work and not working. And because they're living that authentically, okay? And so living an authentic life tends to have a more positive effect on our mental health than just going from the day-to-day dredges of life. Um, Framing information in the positive instead of the negative. I think this one is somewhat self-explanatory. Whenever we look for only the bad things in life, I've known people who could go to Disneyland and Disney World, which are supposed to be the happiest places on earth. I think that's what they say in their advertisements. But everything they see, they can only see something bad in it, something negative, something that's going to go wrong. Okay. This has an impact on mental health as well. Okay. Willingness to experience new things. I think this has a lot to do with engaging life. In fact, I think these two can be combined. The willingness to be open to experience versus being closed to experience. Okay. Engage in the world and retreating from the world. Engaging in the world means we this is kind of the lifelong learner idea, that we're continually learning, we're continually trying to find something interesting about our world, versus the person who just says, you know what, I have enough knowledge, I have enough information, I know the world enough. We tend to find that those individuals have less mental health, or have mental health issues, and those who are continued, those kind of continued lifelong learners, tend to have more positive mental health. And we can't deny, biological and physical issues. Our biological health, our physical health does have an impact on our mental health. It has quite a large impact, as we will see. When we talk about suicide later in the course, we'll talk about two categories of individuals who tend to try to attempt to commit suicide. One of the first category is those that are dealing with loss in their life, either loss of a loved one, loss of a relationship, loss of work, and loss of identity, of some identity that they have. Okay. The second category of individuals that we see are people who just cannot handle their physical illness anymore. Probably the group that is most susceptible to that is, there's a disorder where you get constant ringing in your ear and you can't escape that ringing, and that tends to drive a lot of individuals with that disorder to just want to end it. Okay, and so we can't deny that our biology and our physical health don't have an influence on our mental health. It definitely does, especially when we're not taking care of our body physically, or we end up with some disorder. This is why a lot of places that deal with that work with individuals with chronic illnesses such as cancer, heart disease, and stuff, often have support groups They have counselors, because they know that those, especially those chronic types of disorders, can have a huge influence on a person's mental health. So we can't deny that. Does anybody have any questions about these elements of mental health? Oh, and I'm going to add this, does anybody have any additional categories that you can think of that could be added?
On the one you talked about, the Disneyland, where you always see the negative in something, is that an actual disorder?
It's not a disorder, but it's definitely a personality trait. And when I say personality trait, it's a disposition within some individuals. We do find that there is some associations. The associations are not strong with life experience, such as maltreatment or abuse in childhood, and those types of things tend to develop this negative type of thinking frame. And so we do see that life experience plays a pretty big role in the development of negative framing. But it is very much more of it's a personality trait. And when I do see people who are negatively framing, as a psychologist, I do worry, because of those associations with past negative events. It is definitely worth exploring with them, and because they may have other mental health issues that have been unresolved. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I
Good.
was just wondering if it was classified as and had a name, or because my mom was kind of like that,
Yeah.
and I would mention it to her, but I didn't know if that was just like you said from the upbringing, the expectation, or I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and just something, people who negative frame, when there's the reason why I mentioned that it's a personality trait is it's really something that is ingrained within the individual. It's something part of who they are, right? And so think about when people insult one of something that makes is your personality trait. Like for example, most of the time I'm very laid back, and so have a very laid back personality. But once in a while, I'll get upset or I'll react too quickly, and and the person involved will say, start saying, "Oh, you're this way," blah 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 blah, and I get offended, right? I get, "No, I'm not. No, I'm not." Um, and so when we're looking at that from people who have a negative frame, and you bring that to their attention, their first instinct is to protect their personality, to protect their identity, right? And so they'll say, "No, I'm not that way. You're just, how have I heard this? You're just oversensitive." And so stuff like that. So it is a very difficult thing to bring to people's attention. So, and I imagine that was very difficult to bring to your mom's attention on her end as well, right?
Yes, and I wondered, do I have that trait? Since my mom did.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, right?
Okay.
Because we definitely inherit a lot of our personality from our parents. So,
Right.
yeah.
That's why I wonder: is it a disorder that has a name?
No, no, no. It's more of a personality trait. So. Which we'll get into there. It can be a component of different disorders, but it's not necessarily a disorder in and of itself. So we'll get to that as we move through the course. Okay. All right. I think what we should do for today is end right here. Let me do this.